Hi, welcome to my channel where I bring you some of the best threads on X. Today, I'm covering one of the gaming industry's biggest mistakes, Nintendo stabbing Sony in the back at CES 1991. They thought they were being clever, but that one decision created their biggest rival. This is the story of how Nintendo's betrayal birthed the PlayStation empire. Let's rewind to 1988. Nintendo dominated the gaming world, but they had a problem. Their games ran on cartridges, which were expensive to make and had limited storage. Enter Sony, who had mastered the cheaper, higher capacity CD-ROM technology.
Nintendo and Sony used to work together like peanut butter and jelly, or in video game terms, like the A and B buttons. On one side, Nintendo all but had the home console market locked up with the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and had legendary games to back them up, like Mario and Zelda.
Sony, whatever will they think of next?
And Sony was on the other side, being a bleeding-edge tech company, and had a part in developing the compact disc, the CD, new technology that would help video games evolve into the third dimension. It could have been a match made in heaven, if not for Nintendo spiking the deal at the last minute. It might be hard to believe, but Nintendo and Sony almost brought the PlayStation into the world together. This strange-looking box had a slot for Nintendo cartridges and a disc drive for CDs produced by Sony. It was almost the best of both worlds, but Nintendo was afraid that it might be the end of theirs.
Nintendo's president Hiroshi Yamauchi saw an opportunity. Partner with Sony to create a Super Nintendo with CD-ROM capabilities. The deal was signed. Sony would develop the PlayStation, a hybrid console that could play both Nintendo cartridges and CDs. But there was a catch.
With the support needed from Norio, the deal continued and went on to be Nintendo's best countermeasure against their rival, the Sega Genesis. It was a strong partnership that yielded favorable results, so it's not surprising that soon after, Sony and Nintendo entered into a new partnership. This time, Norio was on board from the beginning. Sony would be developing a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Before now, Nintendo consoles had only been able to accommodate low-quality cartridges, and with Sony's history of CD-based products, the future looked bright and more clear. Along with the Super Nintendo add-on, Sony would also be releasing a separate console, a hybrid that would incorporate both CD and cartridge playability. It was to be known as the PlayStation. The time for Sony to be creating gaming consoles was finally.
The contract gave Sony complete control over the CD format licensing. This meant Sony would earn money from every CD game sold, even those made by Nintendo. Nintendo had inadvertently handed significant power to a potential rival, and Yamauchi was starting to panic. Behind closed doors, Nintendo executives were growing paranoid. They feared Sony would use this deal to enter the gaming market and eventually compete with Nintendo. So they hatched a plan that would go down as one of the biggest betrayals in tech history.
It's June 2nd, 1991. Thousands have gathered to hear the latest in electronic news. Little do they know, they are about to witness a backstabbing. A much-anticipated speech by Nintendo is about to take place, exactly 24 hours after Sony's announcement was made, one where they outlined their upcoming collaboration with Nintendo. Because when Nintendo takes the stage, they will reveal something much different. They would be creating the exact thing Sony had described, the only issue, it was without them.
June 1991, the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. Sony proudly announced the Nintendo PlayStation to the world. They had working prototypes, and marketing materials were ready, but Nintendo had a shocking surprise planned for the very next day. At their own press conference, Nintendo announced they were abandoning Sony. Instead, they'd partner with Sony's rival Philips for the CD-ROM technology. Sony's executives were blindsided. They learned about the betrayal while watching Nintendo's announcement. The humiliation was total.
It was going well. 2 years and 100 prototypes later, the two companies were ready to announce their joint project to the world. At the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, Sony took the stage. They made their announcement that, in partnership with Nintendo, the PlayStation was coming and that they would be creating super discs to be used with it. The anticipation had been heightened. All seemed to be going smoothly. Unfortunately, that feeling of excitement would not last long, because a mere 24 hours later, Nintendo took the stage. Sony was under the impression that Nintendo's speech would outline their partnership, but Nintendo had other plans. Nintendo had come to the realization that the contract they signed a year ago heavily favored Sony. Sony was planning to keep all of the rights to the games they would develop. Nintendo had missed that. And so, the day after Sony's announcement of their partnership, it was Nintendo's turn. In their speech, they did the unthinkable. Instead of partnering with Sony, they told the world they would be working with Sony's rival, Philips. Sony didn't believe it. There had been rumors, but considering they had a contract and working prototypes with Nintendo, how could it be true? But Nintendo had made their decision, and to them, it was final. They even admitted there was a deal with Sony, but that their future lay with Philips. Sony, upon hearing this, was shocked. The president of Sony Electronic Publishing, Olof Olofsson, said, "The spirit of the agreement was that Sony and Nintendo would work together in developing CD technology. The spirit of the agreement has been violated." He even thought the underhanded deal may be a negotiating ploy, but Nintendo didn't plan on changing their minds.
Sony's CEO, Norio Oga, was furious. He called an emergency board meeting where most executives wanted to cut their losses and exit gaming completely. But Oga reportedly said, "We will never withdraw from this business. Keep going." With this, the PlayStation project was born. Ken Kutaragi convinced Sony to let him continue developing their gaming console, but this time, it wouldn't play Nintendo games. It would be a pure Sony product, designed to compete directly with Nintendo, and they were determined to succeed.
But remember Ken? He wasn't ready to give up on his dreams, not by a long shot. So when a meeting was held in June of 1992 to decide the fate of the PlayStation, everything hung in the balance once again. But Ken knew what to do. He reminded Norio about the betrayal they were dealt by their ex-partners. They had been dishonored in front of the world. It didn't take much else for Norio to respond with, "We will never withdraw from this business. Keep going. Just do it." And with that, the work began. The new system would be known as the PlayStation, removing the space between the words in order to separate from the original deal. The green light was officially given in 1993. And in November of that year, Ken created Sony Computer Entertainment Incorporated, a division where the focus could solely be on video games and digital entertainment.
Nintendo's betrayal had lit a fire under Sony. They poached top gaming talent, built relationships with game developers, offered better licensing terms than Nintendo, and invested heavily in cutting-edge 3D graphics. The PlayStation was taking shape.
Format. One of the biggest losses was losing Squaresoft as a developer. They made the Final Fantasy series. They were some of the best role-playing games on Nintendo consoles. But when it came time to make Final Fantasy VII, Square found cartridges were too limiting for the story they wanted to tell. It would take Nintendo another decade to finally embrace full-size discs with the Wii generation, only to come full circle and go back to cartridges for the Switch. I guess that's just their style though. As for their deal with Philips, the CD add-on for the Super Nintendo never came to pass. It would be teased a couple times in subsequent years, but ultimately ended up being vaporware. I get the feeling Nintendo was okay with this. It was a means to an end for them, and mission accomplished. They got out of their deal with Sony. Philips did get to make a few games starring Nintendo characters, one of the rare times when Nintendo characters can be found on a non-Nintendo console. I don't want to be too harsh on these games because I've never played them myself, but they look terrible. Hotel Mario and 3 of the worst reviewed Zelda games of all time. The popularity of these characters wasn't enough to save the CDI, which died as a platform in 1996. For their part, Nintendo pretends these games never existed, and I don't blame them.
Meanwhile, Nintendo's deal with Philips was falling apart. The few Nintendo games released on Philips CDI, like Hotel Mario and Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon, were disasters. Nintendo had betrayed Sony for nothing, and Sony was about to make them pay dearly for it. December 1994, the PlayStation launches in Japan. It was an instant hit, offering games with faster load times, stunning 3D graphics, cinema-quality sound, and cheaper manufacturing costs. Nintendo's worst fear had come true. The PlayStation dominated the market. It outsold Nintendo's next console, the N64. Game developers flocked to Sony's platform. and Nintendo's market share plummeted. One Betrayal had created their biggest rival, who continue to dominate the market to this day. Remember, in the world of gaming, every move can change the game forever. A lesson that Nintendo learned the hard way.
With huge success, the PlayStation console made its debut in Japan, selling around 100,000 units on its first day and 300,000 by the end of the year. It even went on to sell 1 million units in just 6 months. Over the next few decades, Sony refined and improved the gaming console, from the PS1 to the PS5. There were also small handheld devices released by Sony known as the PlayStation Portable, PSP Go, and PlayStation Vita. It continued to blow its competitors out of the water, selling at numbers neither Sega nor Nintendo could match. The PlayStation 2 even went on to become and remains the highest-selling video game console in history.